Hello, and welcome to the Less is More Education podcast with your host, Steve Flores. And this is episode 23. So I thought I'm in my experimental stage. So I thought today what I would do is I wanted to start to learn more about learning and education and hopefully be a little bit of use to teachers in like a very functional way. So today I'm going to go over, or basically try to summarize as best I can, research on a paper called Motivation: What Teachers Need to Know by Carole Ames. And I'm going to start off with like a story. And tell me if this sounds familiar to any of you guys, because this happened to me repeatedly when I was a teacher. So I'd be looking around, I'd see a student, they're on their phone or they're goofing off, or or maybe they're just not doing anything. They're just staring off blankly into the wall. And I go up to them and I say, hey, so how come you haven't started? Like, is there anything I can help you with? And they would say, well, I don't know how to do this. I'll be like, okay, all right. So have you read the instructions? No. Okay, so let's read the instructions. And I'll have them read the instructions right there in front of me. And then I'd be like, okay, so now that you read it and you know what to do, let's try out the first problem, and I'll hang out here in case you run into any problems. And they will like apply what they read to their assignment, and then they would get it. They would accomplish the task, and they would then say like, was that it? I'm like, yeah, that's it. You did a good job. Yeah, now you just got to keep going. Some of the questions are going to get a little bit harder, but it's the same basic idea. If you just apply the technique, then you'll get it. And they'd always be astonished. And then I would have to like do that over with them over and over and over and over again. And I really, this happens so often that, I'd have dreams about this, like just students going, I don't get it. I don't want to, and I never really understood really well what was going on until I read this article by Carole Ames. And I read this part that basically says the ability is important in most classrooms. When students' self-concept of ability is threatened, they display failure avoidance motivation. They engage in failure avoiding tactics such as not trying, procrastinating, false effort, and even the denial of effort. And that's when I knew, okay, I think this lady knows what she's talking about, because that's exactly what I just saw in my classroom, or what I had been seeing in my classroom for many, many years. And so what she did is she wrote an article called Motivation: What Teachers Need to Know. And this was published a long time ago. We're talking about over 30, well, is that over 30? Yeah, 32 years ago, in 1990, in Teachers College Record, which is a journal of research, analysis, and commentary in the field of education. And I knew, okay, she actually gets it. So who is Carole Ames? Carole Ames, according to Michigan State University, is a professor emeritus of the educational psychology and former dean of College of Education. She was interested in developmental and social academic motivation in children. And she had a long career. We're talking about like 30 years. She has many publications. She's like, and it's pretty, like from what I read, was very, very like in depth. And she seemed to know a lot about motivation and a lot of like the intricacies of motivation, because motivation is actually kind of a complex topic. So what is this article all about? At its heart, it's basically a pathway to trying to figure out how to get students intrinsically motivated as opposed to extrinsically motivated. And so the difference is intrinsic motivation means that it's coming from within them. Like they want to learn. That's intrinsic motivation. And kids have a lot of intrinsic motivation. They'll ask a lot of questions, like especially really young children, like around my son's age. He's 4 right now. He asks a lot of questions. If he doesn't understand, he'll keep asking questions until he really gets it, or he gets so confused and gets frustrated, because sometimes I'm long-winded. Yeah. But yeah. And so what we want to do is, and one of the things that she notes in the article is that as kids stay longer in our education system, they start to switch over from intrinsic motivation to extrinsic motivation, meaning things outside of them become motivating factors. And that's not good because that's not really sustainable. A, right? Kids don't really want to do it. And B, whatever you learn, if you're learning in an extrinsically motivated way, you just kind of forget it. And there's a specific reason as to why you forget it. And you can think about your own experiences in college, right? How many classes did you take where you're just like, I just need to get through this, right? I like, that's the goal. I just need to pass this class, for some of the easier classes, maybe I want to get an A or a B. And for some of the harder classes, like when I took physical chemistry, I was like, I just want to pass. That's all. Like, can I just pass, please? I'll just do whatever it takes. And then as soon as I'm out of the classroom, I forget everything, and then I move on with my life. And that seems to be what extrinsic motivation tends to do to people, and so let's figure out a little bit more. And that's what this article is all about. And so the way she writes the article is she writes about motivation across 3 different dimensions that she calls like constructs. And they are self-worth, attributions and related metacognitive beliefs, and achievement goals. I know that middle one is kind of long, like difficult to understand, but I'll break it down. Throughout each dimension, also, what she does is she makes a distinction between young children and older children, because young children do something that older children don't do, and that is they equate effort with ability. So very, very young children, if you praise their effort, hey, you tried really hard, that's the exact same thing as praising their ability. Like, hey, you might as well have just told them, hey, you did a good job, right? So as kids get older, they start to switch that off, and then they start to make a distinction between effort and ability, and then they start to like value ability over effort with time, right? So if you tell an older student, hey, at least you tried hard, they're just going to look at that as, I'm being condescended to right now. That doesn't make me feel good. Or I'm being called stupid right now is basically what that means. And so, but for young kids, that's not really the case. So let's go over the first construct here, which is self-worth. Now, self-worth was one of these like causal things. So when your dog wags its tail after getting like some really high quality belly rubs, right? I take my dogs, I rub them, I get behind the ears, I get all their sweet spots, their legs shaking, right? You start to see indicators that they're happy, right? So their biggest one is their tail starts wagging, and maybe the ends of their mouths will start to curl upward. And so that is very, very apparent. Now, there tends to be amongst teachers like a confusion there, right? So the relationship between self-worth and self-efficacy, think about it as task or situation specific competency, right? So how good you are at a specific competence is very like interconnected, but it's kind of like a one-way street. So students who display confidence that after learning a new skill are a lot like a dog wagging its tail. So Professor Ames argues that a common problem with education is getting the causality backwards. So increasing a student's confidence or self-worth will not increase their self-efficacy. This is crazy that she's writing about this in the 90s, because in the 90s, there was this huge movement towards you have like that self-esteem movement, right? So you can't make kids feel bad. You can't because that's going to hurt them. And and that is not necessarily true. And it's interesting to see that she wrote about it before that big movement happened, and it still happened anyways. So increasing a student's confidence or self-worth will not increase their self-efficacy. Praising a child for the sake of his or her own self-worth is like shaking the dog of a tail and saying, oh, it's happy, right? That's not the way it works. You don't just tell kids they're good and then expect that they're going to achieve academically. That's not the way that works. That's definitely not the way it works. So because young children equate their effort with their ability, You have to praise young children when they actually accomplish something, right? If you just praise young children no matter what, like they goof up or they don't, whether they do a good job or they don't, then they're going to start to believe that, well, whatever I do doesn't really matter. I'm going to get this praise, so I guess I'm just doing excellently. So that's kind of a problem right there. When you give young children, so we're talking about like the earliest ages, like kindergarten, first, second, third graders, when you're giving them praise, it's really important to give them praise that is connected to them actually doing something really good for their level, for their particular level, and not comparing them to the rest of the students. And we're going to take a look at why you don't want to do that later on. But for older children, you're going to have to take a little bit of a different tactic, because older children have a different goal. What they want to do is they want to maximize their achievement, but they want to minimize their effort. That's what they're trying to do. So it's kind of weird, that they want to do that. And the reason why they want to do that is because of social pressure, right? You don't want to be a tryhard, right? Nobody wants to be like, you hear that a lot, and there's different phrases from it, and every generation has its own tryhard phrase, I guess, that they use. But the idea is, if you try really hard and you fail, then your ego takes a big hit. Everybody's judging you, or at least that's what it feels like from their perspective. And then now there's a possibility that you're going to be socially ostracized from everyone else, right? The kids that are looked up to are the kids that appear to not be trying very hard, but they start to accomplish a lot. So this leads to some interesting effects, right? And the interesting effect is that if a kid tries really hard, but they fail anyways, then they start to they activate what's called the failure avoidance mechanism. So examples of this is like what I said earlier: not trying, procrastinating, false effort, the denial of effort, right? And the ironic thing is, by them not trying, by them giving up all of this effort, their achievement is going to go down no matter what, right? So they're not going to be achieving no matter what. But for them, this is failing with honor, right? So I didn't, you can't really say I'm a failure because I didn't even try. You don't know what it's like. You don't know what would have happened if I had tried. You don't know, right? So that's the failure with honor type of deal. So, after all, you can't look dumb if you don't try. So that's self-worth. And I'm going to talk about a little bit later how we can leverage that to kind of help kids stay motivated. So what's the second dimension that we're going to look at for motivation? And that's going to be attributions and related metacognitive beliefs. And so that is a mouthful. So let's try to figure out how to separate that apart. So I once had a student, let's call her Leia. And what she would do is she would constantly compare herself to a bunch of other students and kind of use that as an excuse to not accomplish or not try, or to explain why she was failing, right? So she would just sit there and wait for other people in her group to work. And then, when I would kind of go and ask about that, she would say things like, oh, well, I'm just not as smart as Adam, or, oh, I'm not as good at chemistry as Lucy is, right? And so she would make all of these excuses. So what was happening there, right? And you probably had this same experience in your teaching career. And so it's really important to highlight that for her, she has learned learned helplessness, essentially. So learned helplessness is this idea that any win she had was a matter of luck as opposed to effort. And, well, how did she get that? And that's where we get into the attributions part of this frame, right? Or of this dimension about motivation. So Ames explains that attributions refers to what a person attributes to his or her own like wins or losses. So the attribution is learned, and the student in the classroom can either learn helplessness from these attributions, or they can learn resilience. So there's a way of leveraging this, depending on what's the context of whatever it is that they're learning. So helplessness is learned when you constantly point out failures, right? And this has consequences for, how we grade work, right? A lot of the time, and I'm very guilty of this, a lot of the time when I was grading work, I would go through, and if for all the correct answers, I would just maybe not even write anything. For all the wrong answers, you would cross them out, or you write a comment, or you'd say like, this is what would have been the right answer. And what we're doing to students when we do that is we're pointing out constantly how they're failing, right? And that's not good in terms of how they're going to learn. Because what that teaches them is that, oh, no matter how hard I try, I'm constantly failing. I'm constantly failing. I'm constantly failing. But you can get into the other side of that coin, and you can actually get them into more of a resilient state if you start to connect how their wins to their effort. And it's very important to do it in that specific way. Whatever win you have to connect it to effort. And you have to do it almost more often than their failures. And there's a little bit of congruence with like marriage advice, right? I think I don't remember where I heard this, but married couples that have been around together for a while, like there's always like points where, or times where, it feels good, like when your wife is leaving and you go like, hey, you know what? I love you. I have fun at work, or, just know that I care about you. And that's like a win, right? For that relationship. And then there's going to be other times where you'll make a comment and it's like, you sure did make a lot of dishes making dinner today, huh? Right? Yeah. And that goes into the negative category. So you can make, each comment has like a positive affinity and a negative affinity to it. And if your negative comments, I think get to neutral, you have to have 5 positive comments for every 1 negative comment. And if that ratio gets too out of whack, it winds up leading to divorce. And I think that's what the research is. So that's kind of like what's going on over here when you're learning helplessness versus learning hopefulness, right? So what are the comments that you're making to the students? And are you connecting these comments to their effort? So the problem with the constant negative pointing out of everything that went wrong is that they get caught up in this loop, right? So when you constantly point out their errors, they start to believe that whatever they do is going to lead to failure. But as a result, because they get this negative affectation, they start to set lower expectations for themselves. So now what they're doing is they're setting their future selves up for failure. They have a negative affect, so everything they do is going to be a failure. And then they start to apply ineffective strategies, right? So that's when you start to see kids like do, I would call it, but it's probably not a smart thing to call it, but I would call it like they would try stupid things to try and get an answer, right? Or to come up with a correct answer. But if you were to place Leah in a different scenario, and all of these affectations or attributions come after repeated exposure, right? So Leah got to me in that state, right? Where she had a whole lifetime of negative comments. Every once in a while she gets a win, but because it's so rare, it's probably just luck. And so what you want to do is you want to start shifting the students over to the positive side by starting to acknowledge every time they win, right? And starting to acknowledge like, hey, look, like you have 6 wins in this assignment, right? the negative way of saying that is you got 4 wrong, right? So it's like a lot of it has to do with the frames. And it's not just showing them that they can get wins. That's not enough, right? What you have to do is you have to actually give students certain strategies, according to Ames, that would lead them to success. And they have to practice these, and you have to call them out, and you have to show them how these successes constantly, or these strategies constantly lead to success. That's what you want to do, is connect the strategies to success, connect the strategies to the success, connect the strategies to the success. I'm the one doing all the strategies. So that means that I am the one that is succeeding, right? So it's not so much about the praise when they do something well as it is giving them the tools to do well, and then pointing out how they are the ones using the tools to accomplish their tasks or whatever their goals are. So what kind of tools or effective strategies? She talks about organizing and planning, all right? Knowing how to organize and plan. Goal setting. And we're talking about short-term goals, right? Goals that they can achieve by the end of the period or by the end of the week. Short-term goals. Self-monitoring. They need a system of going like, all right, here's my goal. This is where I am on my path to this goal, right? Because they need to be able to gauge that they're moving forward. And self-instruction. Like that's one of the interesting ones, right? They have to know how to teach themselves. That's a strategy. How do you learn? How do you extract out information? Where do you go for information? So each one of those things is what's considered an effective strategy. So you enforce the effective strategies, you apply it to some specific content, and then by the students getting successes by accomplishing this, then they start to get into the metacognitive beliefs. They start to believe that they can achieve. They get to own all of their wins because they're the ones that are doing it, right? So that's attributions and related metacognitive effects. Let's take a look at the third dimension, and that is achievement goals. So achievement goals are, it's kind of like like the goals that you set for the class, or in the classroom setting, or even in the school setting, actually wind up having dramatic effects on how students are motivated. That's a basic way of saying it. So here's an example, right? When I was young, I had one goal, and my goal was I just want to be rich. I grew up poor. The very first apartment I lived in was probably 600 square feet, and it had 6 people in it. Me, my brother, my mom, my dad, his brother, his girlfriend. Like it's just all living in like a 600 square foot apartment. And that is very like in my memory. And so my whole life I started thinking like, I just need to get rich. I need to get out of this situation. I know how bad it can be. And so that became my goal. So I just want to be rich. I was also a fan of this TV show called Dirty Jobs. And now we're talking a little bit later. I'm in middle school, early high school. And the one thing that I really liked about that show is that it taught me, if you're willing to do something that nobody else wants to do, then people will pay you a lot of money. So what I did is I surveyed my class in high school, towards the end of high school, and I was like, what are you going to study? Because I wanted them to ask me back, because I wanted to know, what is it that everyone wants to study? And I found out that nobody wants to study chemistry. Everybody here hates chemistry. So if I study chemistry, then obviously I'm going to make a lot of money. So that's how I chose my major. It's not that I had some passion for science or chemistry or whatever. I was just like, what's the dirtiest job that's out there? Oh, chemistry? All right, I'll learn that. Went to college, did chemistry, went out into industry, made some money. And I was just like, somehow in the course of things, I wound up back in in teaching. And now I'm in like not making any money, and my goals in life have changed, right? Now, but I'm teaching something that I'm not really passionate about. I'm not really like waking up every day dreaming about like experiments in chemistry. And so that led me down a road that I was like, I think I need to get out of this road. I think I need to take a different path. And that's because my goals sucked. My goals sucked is basically all that happened there. And I feel like in California, our education system as a whole sucks at making goals. And in our education system, we're not really careful about our practices because our practices have implied goals attached to them, right? So let's think about the two different kinds of motivation. Professor Ames talks about goals as having two different affinities. One of them for mastery orientation, and mastery orientation is the interest in learning new things for the sake of just learning them, and then developing the skills and abilities to master that thing that you want to learn about. And that is what we call like intrinsic motivation. That's like another name for it. It's want to learn this thing is coming from within us. We are motivated to do that thing. The other kind of affinity that you can have is what we call what Ames calls performance orientation. It's also sometimes called normative performance, right? Because it's comparative to what the norm in the classroom is. And that focuses more on ability to do a certain task. And so that creates a situation where students are motivated to achieve. And that is different than being motivated to learn. Because when you're motivated to achieve, what tends to happen is once you achieve your final product, whatever it is, it could be a test, it could be a grade, right? It could be a set of classes, then you're done with it. And that's when you forget everything. How many times has that happened to you, even in your college careers, where you're taking a class and you're just like, I'm over this, right? And I just need a pass. You take it, you pass it, and then you forget all about it, right? You just have no clue what happened there whatsoever. Yeah, that's because your motivation was wrong. You were motivated to pass that class. You were not motivated to really understand that topic. And if you want students to want to learn, then you have to ask yourself, all right, what are the things that I'm doing in my classroom and how are they pushing the students? Are they pushing the students to be motivated to achieve, or are they pushing the students to be motivated to learn? On a state level, I feel like we're pushing kids to achievement as opposed to wanting to learn. And we're pushing them towards achievement because we're saying, hey, you have to finish these classes because these classes will allow you to graduate, or these classes will allow you to go to college. That's achievement. That's not an internal motivation to want to learn these topics. So how do you give students the motivation to learn? And the key is give them choices. That's it. Give them lots of choices, as many choices as you can possibly give them. The more choices, the better. So if we think about how our practices, let's think about one of the things that she writes is typical evaluation practices, tests, quizzes, and other assessments are normally set on an absolute scale rather than individual growth scale, which makes them normative. Actually, she didn't write that. I wrote that, right? But that's one of the things that she was looking at. It was like she was looking at different categories and saying these are all normative. And because they're normative, they don't allow the students to want to learn anything. It just compares all the students up against each other. The real clue is, can you get a student to compare themselves to their older selves? If you compare them to their older selves, then that gives them a pathway to like, okay, I want to like beat the whatever I was before and move forward. And that is a powerful idea. And so she says like things like, posting up test scores where all the kids can see everyone's scores. That's bad because that's normative, because each person is comparing themselves to each other person. What would be better is if you set up a goal and then you show the students how they're making progress to that goal, right? And that goal has to be in part, maybe not completely, but in part has to be selected by them, because now they're taking ownership of it. They're choosing to want to accomplish that goal. And then all you have to do is just show them how to track their progress to it. So this way the kids can know, oh, I've stalled. Maybe I should get some help. Maybe I need to do something, right? But because I want to do this, I want to accomplish this task. And then maybe they need some help. You can help them out, and then they'll start working towards it, but they own it. It's not up to us as teachers to do that to them. And so other things that are what we call normative would be like extrinsic rewards, right? Or even any kind of extrinsic reward system. If you think about systems that we use in our classroom, if they are normative, if you're applying the same system to all students equally, well, you're applying it to high students as well as low achieving students. And most of the systems that you set up in your classroom are set up to, change the behavior of the lower achieving students. What do you think that says to high achieving students when you apply that same system to them, right? It's like their individuality almost doesn't even matter. So extrinsic rewards. Extrinsic rewards are grades, certain kinds of praise, material rewards, place an emphasis on performance rather than learning. So that's one of the things that you have to be careful with extrinsic rewards, because then the reward becomes the goal, not the actual learning itself. So ask yourself, what are the systems that I'm applying into my classroom? Are they encouraging these kids to achieve, or are they encouraging these kids to want to learn, right? And you have to strike a balance with that. And another thing is like ability grouping. Ability grouping is very normative because, well, how do you know their abilities? You look at their grades. I have A, B, C, Ds. I'm going to put an A student, a B student, a C student, and a D student in this group, right? Well, that's all normative, right? They all took the same test. They all took the same exam. So you're really comparing them to each other and then putting them into a group based on those comparisons. So that might not be a good idea if you want them to be intrinsically motivated, right? Okay. So how do you enhance motivation? And this is the cool part about Ames is she gives us like 5 different scenarios, each one to kind of show us how to make the research on motivation useful. And that's one of the things that she points out is, hey, we have all this research on motivation, but it's not being applied. It's not being put to good use in these credentialing or teacher preparation programs. So how do we make them more useful? So she gives some very useful advice. And the first one that she talks about is about learned helplessness. And so she states learned helplessness cannot be overcome by having success alone, right? They need to know how to set short-term goals and strategies to achieve those goals. And then they have to be able to track their progress towards those goals. So students must experience how applying strategies leads to success. This will cause them to own their success. So what are you doing? Like, what is it that you want them to learn? Can you break that up into a bunch of different steps? Can you give them choices in how to accomplish each one of those steps and then come up to their final product, right? That's the research. And this is amazing that this is 30 years old research, right? And I was just barely seeing it being, pushed onto teachers when right before I left. All right, next. Praise. Praise must connect to the task at hand and effort or performance. And again, that really depends on the age range, right? So for really young kids, you can praise their effort. That's the same thing as praising their achievement. For older kids, you might every once in a while praise their effort, but what you really want to do is you want to make whatever praise you give them specific to them and to whatever task that they're trying to accomplish. So whatever goal they set up. And that's going to be really important. Just make that as specific as you can possibly make it, because then that shows them, okay, there is some value. I'm not just being hit for every negative thing or every problem that I get wrong. I'm getting praised for meeting my own goals. And that's going to be really important. Next, rewards are being overused. She doesn't say you shouldn't use rewards at all. She's just saying like they're just way too overused. And you got to be careful of thinking about, all right, is the reward that I'm giving students, is that going to influence or push them to be more extrinsically motivated or more intrinsically motivated? And so what's the system? What are you trying to do? So having a reward system that is meant to encourage the least achieving students applied to the entire class, this is what I was saying earlier, ignores individuals' differences in interest, performance, and ability. So that's a devaluation of individuals. So you got to be careful with those. Next is giving students choices. Again, choice. That's so important when you want somebody to be intrinsically motivated, right? You're not going to be motivated if you have no choices. That's just human nature, all that is. So she writes, and I like this part. She writes, when normative evaluation and public comparisons are expected, students' choices reflect an avoidance of challenge and a preference for tasks that ensure success. In other words, a choice is not an equal choice in some contexts. When evaluation is pending on one's final product, choices are not based on interest. They more likely reflect a protection of one's ability and concern for one's level of performance. So what that means is choices must matter when it comes to evaluation. And the last aspect that she goes into is be careful about telling kids to try harder. that's in general, that's probably something you should stay away from doing, especially to young children, because young children already believe that they are trying their best, that they're doing their best, right? Again, they have a lot of this intrinsic motivation. They already believe that they're trying really hard. So telling young children to try harder is like telling a fish to breathe water. It's like, well, isn't that what I was doing? All that's going to do is that's going to cause the fish to have a panic attack, right? So by telling young children to try harder, that's just going to make them question what it is that they're doing. Like, am I even doing the right thing? I thought I was trying hard. And so that's going to decrease their self-efficacy. So that's going to decrease their ability to accomplish whatever goal that they have at hand. And then that's going to start to give them that negative attribution, right? And so you got to be careful about that. Also, for older children, what they want to do is they want to minimize their effort and get the highest achievement, right? So telling them, hey, try harder is not going to be a useful tactic to them, because they're purposely not trying to not try, right? Which is, kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. So the other thing that you have to be careful about effort is that if you try to maximize effort at all times, you're just going to burn them out. That's just what happens when you try to maximize effort. So you got to be careful, and you got to be really selective about when you want kids to put in their full effort, right? They're going to want to put in their full effort when they have a very difficult task, but maybe when they have easier tasks, they can have a little bit of a more relaxed environment, and that's to preserve their willpower. And so another thing she writes is, if we want teachers to apply attribution theory to classroom practice, they need to know that whether they convey to the students that effort is important depends on how they structure tasks, evaluate students, and give recognition and rewards. So each one of those parts is going to be important, and you got to ask yourself, all right, is this going to intrinsically motivate them? Or is this going to extrinsically motivate them? All right. Is this going to create a situation where they want to learn or not? So key ideas is, oh, don't just highlight the failures, highlight the successes, but make sure that when you do highlight those successes, you connect it specifically to something that student is doing, right? Giving a general, hey, the whole class did well, you just wasted time. That's not useful. Now, a lot of these techniques that she's saying to apply are very, on their face, they look like they're going to be very difficult to apply to a large classroom, right? But I'm not telling you that you should change everything right now. One of the things that I found was really helpful when I was teaching was taking this like baby step approach. Maybe I'm going to change one thing this year. Maybe I'll change another thing next year. And then with time, I believe that I would get to a state where I could be the best teacher that I could be. But it just creates little changes. And you could start off anywhere. You could start off by just asking yourself, all right, how can I give students more choices? And how can I, when I do that, how can I show them the skills that they need to get to the end goal? And how can I have them track their own progress, right? And you can check in with their own progress and the goals that they've set for themselves, right? And what you want to do is you want to make sure that you treat each one of your students as individuals to the best of your ability. You're not going to be doing a perfect job. There's no such thing as doing a perfect teaching job. It's impossible, especially when you have 5 preps and only an hour to prep them all out. It's difficult, right? It's very difficult. And so there should also be a statement here of be willing to forgive yourself when you're not perfect. You're in this for the long haul, and it's not helpful to be hypercritical of yourself if you're not doing everything perfectly all the time. It's okay. In the end, the students will forgive you. If anything, I forgive you. So with that, let's call it a day. Thank you for, being a part of listening to the podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to support the podcast, just like and subscribe it. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors. You can email me at lessismore.education@skift.com. You can find me on Instagram at lessismore.education. Twitter is at lessismoreeduc and the number 1. The Patreon, if you want to, buy me a coffee a month, it's going to be at patreon.com/lessismoreeducation. And also check out my writing. Everything that I'm doing now is I'm writing it down and I'm putting it online at Substack. So you can find me at lessismoreeducation.substack.com if you prefer listening to or reading as opposed to listening to me. A lot of it's very similar content. And if you want to see me, you can find me on YouTube at lessismore.education, and or just type in lessismoreeducation. You'll find me. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate you, and I really appreciate your support. Thank you.